The Carrier Empath. The Carrier Empath is a particular cadre, and the carrier can be found amongst any of the schools. The standard empath, the super empath, the codependent empath, and the contagion empath. Therefore, carrier can be found linked to any of those schools. The carrier empath is not a standalone form of empath, but rather is embodied by exhibiting carrier tendencies which bolt on to the relevant class of empathic individual. The carrier empath is the doer, the organizer. This is the individual that is invariably relied upon, for example, to attend to domestic duties, who will be found engaging in childcare. Perhaps the individual that would be organising the social life of the household. They're the individual that may well look after members of the family and extended family when people fall unwell. It is not only the case, however, that the carrier empath deals with the practicalities of life. They shoulder, more than the other cadres, the emotional burden. The carrier empath rarely talks about themselves, although there is much that they could talk about, either as a consequence of their natural intelligence, which lends itself to the ability to undertake considerable discourse, or their ability to understand people and engaged in what could be termed as small talk, so people are put at ease, or simply their extensive experiences mean that they have much that they could share with other people. The carrier cadre of empath does not see it as necessary to talk extensively about themselves. All empaths are good listeners to a degree. It is one of the empathic traits which our kind look for. But the carrier empath generally is a superlative listener. Exhibiting considerable patience, he or she will sit and listen to the woes and problems of others. They do not jump to conclusions, as many people would, instinctively forming a view of the person that they are engaging with within moments of meeting. Instead, the carrier is able to resist making an early judgment about a person, and instead will listen to what they have to say, so that they can then work out how best to assist. The carrier empath knows full well that sometimes just being listened to is the best thing for another person. The carrier does not absorb the woes of the other person unless that's linked to them being a contagion carrier. In those circumstances, their capacity for absorbing the energy or the emotion of another person is amplified by this combination of carrier and contagion. They not only feel the emotion of the other individual, but they shoulder the burden of the problems associated with that emotion. In some instances, this can actually be favourable, for they take on the joy and happiness of an individual that is experiencing delight. But more usually, they have the capacity to deal with and absorb the anger, the frustration, the hurt, the upset of the person that is talking to them. They do not necessarily need to offer a solution. They do not necessarily have to act upon it. But instead, they absorb both the emotion and the problem in order to alleviate the burden on the other person. Not only is the carrier empath an organizer, somebody who will be first to say, let me handle that, in varying degrees dependent upon the strength of the cadre. But if one was to embody the essence of a carrier, it is the capability to take the burden from another person and say, let me take that for you. The carrier empath is that type of individual that comes along and lifts the weight of the world off you and places it upon themselves. That in itself does not necessarily create a problem for the carrier. They're built to do this. They are, by design, capable of not only dealing with their own issues, but taking on those of other people as well. They have been designed to carry. They have been designed to alleviate the burden for other individuals. And they do so willingly, without fanfare or performance. Those with carrier tendencies are work-like in their approach. They are reliable, organized, and effective when facing pressure. They regard it as their role to take on the responsibility of others, and, in some instances, will struggle to determine the boundary of when they should not do so. Whilst they are designed to take on the burden of others, there comes a point where the carrier, dependent upon the strength of the carrier percentage, can start to take on the woes and tribulations of other people to the extent that it does start to become a burden for them, because the carrier struggles to determine the boundary of when they should not do so. They are unable to avoid taking on other people's issues and problems and feel a compulsive need to assist, but to do so through actions and a practical application of their compassion, honesty, decency, and understanding. The carrier is not, in general terms, a person who overflows with emotion, but is certainly not devoid of it. Their emotional output does not appear in surges and spikes, almost histrionic reactions as a consequence of the situation that they find themselves in, but they're more of a steady eddy, a steady and reliable provider of fuel through their evident compassion and supportive nature. Whilst caught in the dizzying devaluation, some empaths will find themselves despairing and having up days and down days whilst they experience the push and pull behaviours. The carrier empath is more likely to adopt a stoic approach to it. Inside, he or she may be churning, but they do their best to maintain a brave face as they seek to remain dependable and to forge a path moving forward. They are built to be solid and dependable. The carrier is not a dullard, but they do not shine and glow in the same way as other empathic individuals may well do. They are instead grounded, practical, pragmatic, and excellent problem solvers. The carrier is unable to leave responsibility with others. They regard it as their task to be responsible for other people, and they rarely judge the flaws of others, but rather see it as an opportunity for them to shoulder the burden. They will remain with those who suffer, for example, from addictions, seeing it as part of their obligation to remain and support those that are afflicted. The empath will take on the problems of others, and will do so even where this might be a drain on their resources, such as time and money. But they do not do so to the extent of it causing them real harm. That is linked to the martyr. An instance would be, for example, they may need to be somewhere else, but somebody has telephoned them and wants help. The carrier empath will continue to listen, but not to the extent that it would cause them a problem with their other engagement. They would seek to juggle both, pushing back the appointment while still listening to that individual, or explaining that they had to go now, but they would contact them in a couple of hours to make sure that they are all right. There is this strong sense of obligation on the part of the carrier. Whilst empaths as a whole feel obligation, the carrier empath will assist in a way that they feel good about doing so. In effect, although it isn't the same as the fuel that a narcissist receives, it's their own form of fuel that comes from helping others. A codependent invariably helps because of the nature of giving enables them to find validation in terms of their place in the order of things. A super empath relishes the challenge that is presented and regards as an opportunity to exhibit their powers. And layer the carrier onto those schools, and you add a complexion of obligation. The relevant class of empath does it because that is what should be done, that is the right thing to do, and they have an obligation to care. They recognize that the task in hand may well be difficult. They will note that it will be a drain upon resources, but their fearsome sense of duty causes them to be the first to volunteer and the last to give up. This division of empathic individual is certainly compassionate, but approaches matters in a practical manner rather than hearts and flowers. And whilst they will certainly use words to comfort, to support, and to show empathy, they much prefer to rely upon their actions. If someone is suffering, rather than hand out tea and sympathy, the carrier will assume the mantle of the problem themselves and tackle it head on. They are especially apt at standing in the shoes of somebody in order to absorb the blast on behalf of someone who is struggling or wants their help. They are the proverbial person who would take the bullet, but manage to do so in a way without it causing problems for them. Such is their level of resilience, they can stand in the way of the advancing truck, but it won't flatten them. The empath that does so to the extent that the truck flattens them is the martyr. Carrier empaths are prized by our kind, but by certain narcissists in particular. They naturally provide fuel. That always has to be there as one of the prime aims, but it doesn't necessarily fountain from the carrier empath. Graters tend not to gravitate towards those with high carrier empath tendencies as a primary source because the greater is invariably most resourceful themselves, has a number of people around them that are able to carry out the minion-related tasks, and therefore does not need to rely upon an individual as a primary source to do all of the fetching and carrying for them. The greater would look to their primary source to satisfy other aspects instead. The carrier empath is desired more by the lesser and mid-range schools, particularly lesser, and especially where there is the combination of the cadre of victim narcissist. Accordingly, lower lesser victim, middle lesser victim will look for those with high carrier traits. Lower mid-range victim, similarly so. Middle range A and middle range B were more likely to look for a moderate level of carrier empath as a combination of requiring support, but the fact that they engage in the maintenance of a facade of themselves of being helpful. Upper mid-range similarly requires someone to do some of the fetching and carrying, but it doesn't need to be overwhelmingly so, because they're also of a capability themselves. The victim cadre of narcissists derives fuel from the provision of care and the exhibition of compassion. That narcissist's less impressive countenance is not one which will result in gushing praise and over-the-top appreciation of them. There's very little to praise. Instead, the exhibition of care and compassion is what provides them with the fuel that the victim narcissist wants, plus, of course, the residual benefits of being looked after. Somebody who will look after the children, change the bedding, do the laundry, provide medication, go and do the food shopping, do the cooking and cleaning, etc. Alongside, of course, listening to that particular narcissist bang on about their problems, aches and pains. Therefore, for the victim cadre of narcissist, there is a preference towards the caring of the carrier, as opposed to someone who would necessarily gush with praise, but does little in the way of practical care. Those with carrier tendencies are much more suited to the victim narcissist. Furthermore, the carrier empath comes with considerable residual benefits in terms of the provision of caring for someone with poor health, dealing with the chores and problems on that person's behalf, providing food, shelter, money, and the like, and therefore this raft of residual benefits appeals to lesser narcissists in particular, alongside those which are of the victim cadre. The carrier's capacity for taking the bullet results in them also having appeal to the mid-range narcissist. The passive-aggressive mid-range narcissist who finds that he or she is not able to get their way with a third party will invariably turn to the carrier empath to step up on his or her behalf and get the problem sorted. If weakened from a lack of fuel and potential criticism from this third party, the mid-range narcissist will turn to the carrier empath to make everything all right again, and the carrier empath will dutifully attend to this. During devaluation, the carrier empath finds themselves confused by the manipulations used against them, but their sense of duty carries them forward, and they will often fall victim to the narcissist's capacity to blame others. Accordingly, if the narcissist blames his outburst on being overworked, the carrier empath will accept this explanation and will then look at ways at alleviating the load on the narcissist by taking more on him or herself, or even going so far as to, say, challenge the boss of the narcissist to secure a reduction in workload. This is also the case if there is a combination of carrier and savior. The narcissist instinctively knows that with a carrier empath, he can in fact point that person in the direction of problem, and the carrier empath will go and solve it. Again, this is why the greater has less need of those with high carrier tendencies, and why those of a lesser or mid-range school have more reliance on the carrier. Mid-rangers particularly want that combination of moderate carrier and moderate or high savior, so that they have somebody that will ride into battle on their behalf and confront other individuals, and at the same time be able to provide a practical explanation and application to resolve the issue. Thus, they will challenge somebody whilst at the same time offer the solutions, something that the cowardly mid-range narcissist very much prefers. Devaluation causes those with carrier tendencies to battle on in the hope of resolving the narcissist problem. The carrier is less inclined to blame themselves. They do not see themselves as the cause of the problems which the narcissist alludes to during devaluation, but rather only blame themselves for not resolving those problems. The carrier is blinded to understanding that there is no fix, but regards every problem as capable of having a solution, which will, with the right application of energy and resources, eventually present itself. The worse the narcissist becomes during devaluation, the more those with the carrier tendency will apply themselves to trying to sort the problem out, and usually identifies an external source, wrongly, as the source of the problem, and then finds themselves sent ultimately on a wild goose chase, trying to tackle this external source while the problems continue unabated. If the relevant narcissist does not have a primary source with those strong carrier tendencies, it is likely therefore one will be recruited as the secondary source. This is more likely with the greater, as I've explained, who would rather have the primary source for other purposes rather than providing a host of residual benefits in terms of carrier, and they will have various secondary sources who can be turned to as and when required, perhaps at a moment of difficulty, to be utilized for their carrier traits. Whilst the lesser and mid-range narcissists, and especially those of the victim narcissist cadre of those two schools, will want a carrier empath with high carrier capabilities, usually either majority carrier, very strong, or strong. the greater is more likely to position a carrier secondary source as a lieutenant. It's common to find that the scapegoated child of a narcissist, if they avoid becoming a narcissist themselves, tends to exhibit strong carrier tendencies, because they realize by getting things done, having to attend to their own needs because the narcissistic parent has abandoned their duties at an early stage, and also having to parent the narcissistic parent, is the most effective method of survival. They care, but do so without showiness, and deliver in a practical and dependable manner. It is also worth noting that as some narcissists age, they will gravitate more to securing a primary source who is a carrier empath, either majority, very strong, or strong. Though the provision of fuel remains important, the need for the residual benefits of caring become increasingly important for those narcissists who see their looks fading, their mobility decreasing, and therefore suffer a reduction in their ability to charm and attract. Of course, this is not applicable to all of our kind, since many narcissists become distinguished with age, have the magnetism that is innate to them. They maintain their financial firepower, and their innate charisma and sharp mind remained undulled. However, for those further down the evolution of the narcissist that see the waning of their powers, the carrier empath becomes more attractive to them. With regard to the presentation of carrier empath, some people don't have it as an outcome. Alternatively, if they do, it will either be insignificant, significant, strong, very strong, or majority. In those circumstances, the varying level by which they are influenced by that carrier trait varies, and also in terms of the extent to which they will carry the burden for others. If you are interested in learning whether you are a carrier empath and to what extent, then undertake the empath detector to learn if you are an empath, and if so, the school and cadre. You can find the link in the video description. I'm H.G. Tudor. Thank you for listening.